If you found yourself in metropolitan Raleigh, driving through Wake Forest at 5 p.m. is nearly the last thing you want to be doing. I was part of the problem on the evening of April 15th, heading up CSX's Norlina subdivision to try my luck at the line's local job. I pulled off north of Henderson around 5:45 and had a train coming my way 20 minutes later. MP-15DC number 1186 had been part of train L617's power set for almost a year, sandwiched comfortably between two Jeeps. With the south-facing engine's sudden departure the night before, the rest of Raleigh and I hedged a bet that 1186 would temporarily lead south. It was wonderful to be right, as the funky-looking engine guided 15 cars down the Norlina subdivision. This piece of railroad dates back to the 19th century, eventually owned by the Seaboard Coast Line to connect Raleigh and Richmond. What remains of the Carolinian portion now terminates in Norlina, with about a dozen active customers on the 55-mile branch line. I've wanted to explore it for a few months, and today's rare MP-15 liter was the perfect excuse to do just that. I was surprised at the train's quick clip and beat it by the skin of my teeth 5 miles south on scene at Eastern Minerals. The facility's vertical hoppers made for a great backdrop, showing off their varying degrees of age in the evening's golden sunlight. Having just departed Vulcan's Greystone Quarry north of Henderson, L617 was again squealing to a stop to do some more switching. This began with splitting off the main line and a half-mile-long shove east in order to work the massive Mars elevators. The hoppers are unfortunately not full of cocoa, but rather dog food. As it was at this road crossing, I learned Mars Pet Care and Mars Confectionery are two totally separate companies. Designed for increased visibility during switching operations, this body type has creatively been nicknamed end cabs. Implemented on a variety of MP and SW series switchers, they departed from EMD's normal stature with a low and long hood and a cab on the very rear. Neither MPs or SWs are prevalent in today's railroading scene, as the 1186 is one of only 25 MP-15 DCs on CSX's roster. She was built in 1978 as Seaboard Coast Line Engine 4216 and has spent all 47 of her years operating for the CSX family. To see it leading on what has been home rails all its life, 1186 was an extraordinary treat to witness on the scruffy branch line. While 1186 stole the show, trailing engine number 6572 warrants a mention. One of 154 of CSX's 4-axle -3 rebuilds, 6572 somehow escaped the notorious SpongeBob cab. That's perfectly okay with me, as the L&N lived on alongside the SCL this evening, with 6572's notched headlight harkening back to the days of gray and yellow. Skipping down to where the Mars siding joins the main line, I could have been 40 years younger and not known any better. I love this aspect of rail fanning whenever numerous, unrelated variables come together to create a sight that can take oneself decades back. The vintage trackside automobiles set the scene quite nicely. Although Mars is south of Eastern Minerals, the former was worked first in order to simultaneously uncover the latter's setouts. When train crews are as in tune with their operation as these guys are, it makes switching very enjoyable to watch. Every move is a calculated piece of a puzzle that lasts the whole shift, which was now unfolding at Eastern Minerals. This customer receives tanks, hoppers, and boxcars across 5 different locations on site, so I wasn't quite sure what to expect. But with half an hour of sunlight and the eclectic power set to boot, I figured I may as well stick around. As stated, the end cabs were produced to increase visibility, although one might wonder how that's accomplished when the engine is orientated such as 1186 is. I believe these locomotives were meant to operate in pairs, with each cab facing out, even though EMD has technically designated the long hood as the forward end. I certainly am not one to complain, as the end cabs do look better facing forward, especially when thrashing through some golden light. Having dropped the Canadian Pacific hopper out of sight, the puzzle now continued with a drop of 2 more cars. I believe Eastern Minerals ships in raw chemicals to create compounds for export, but it's hard to tell as their entire product line consists of long, complicated words that I haven't seen since my high school chemistry class. I think it's neat how this run-down-looking facility plays a role in global trade, one covered hopper at a time. With the first 2 drops complete, it was time for the third via Gate 2. I had been eyeing this angle since my arrival and was excited to see the 2 remaining covered hoppers creeping down the buried trackage. The crew had been switching for just over an hour by this point, with their train tucked on the main line as evidenced by the blinking EOT. Of the many rabbit holes one can dive down within the hobby of railroad photography, one of my favorites is trains where trains shouldn't be. Whether it's intrusive foliage, a packed city center, or a siding buried in gravel, there's something so beautiful in the juxtaposition. Eastern Minerals Gate 2 found a train where it shouldn't be, as the MP-15DC couldn't have looked more out of place along the buried trackage beneath the elevators. The drop here was quick, allowing just enough time to scurry across the tracks for a low angle of the end cab emerging. Wearing somewhat of an eye patch, 6572 and 1186 weren't quite done with Eastern Minerals. I was getting close, however, as the sun was soon to set and I had gotten more than I bargained for as far as 1186 was concerned. I'd definitely like to revisit the Norlina subdivision for a full-length chase one morning, but for now, this neat set of locomotives was plenty more than enough. While saying goodbye to the Norlina subdivision, I still had more Class 1 local action up my sleeve. The Norlina sub is one of 2 branch lines shooting north out of the capital city, with the other being Norfolk Southern's D line from Durham to Oxford. I had my sights set on the Durham line 24 hours later, intending to chase local P20 as far north as the sun would allow. Coordinated well with my departure from the day job, P20 is a timely 5 p.m. train out of Durham's rail yard. It wasn't 6 minutes past the hour when the crew rang up the dispatcher, and by 5:09 p.m., P20 was approaching my hideout behind the food line. Interestingly enough, the train is cruising right alongside CSX trackage in the foreground, whose tracks split off the North Carolina Railroad in Durham and parallels NS for just 2 miles. This is to serve 2 customers north of town and makes for an odd landscape, as I had originally figured NS simply had 2 tracks through the area. As with the previous night's leader, I'll never turn down a GP60. I think the faded black makes them look even better, and with a GP40-2 trailing plus 3 covered hoppers for the end of the line, this was set to be a pleasurable chase. Although increasingly mundane due to their C6M intrusion, Norfolk Southern's variety shines in local service. It's the only railroad on this side of the Mississippi where you'll find GP60s, so I knew I had to take advantage when one of their 48 prototypes appeared on the point of P20. I thought it would be an easy chase until the crew kicked it into gear as they traded Durham suburbia for a more rural landscape. I thought track speed was 25 miles an hour, but that was clearly not the case. It took another 8 miles of trackage before I was back in front of the train by Butner, and that's only because P20's speed limit was back down to 10 miles an hour, where it will remain for the rest of the trip into Oxford. I'm set up hillside on an industrial road serving Pallet 1, a company turning wood chips into their namesake. With manufacturing outsourced and railroad companies consolidated over the decades, an innumerable amount of branch lines have become obsolete. What was once a Southern Railway main line connecting Durham to Richmond, today's D line is but a shell of its former self, running just 30 miles into Oxford. Speaking to my point about consolidation, the Southern ran a branch line from Oxford to Henderson, connecting with the same piece of SCL Railroad and its former branches I was exploring the evening prior. It's invigorating to dream of high hoods in their tuxedo liveries drifting through these very woods, but I must remind myself that one day P20 and his Jeeps will be just as memorable as the Southern Railway. Approaching Oxford, the train and I were now in a community called Stem. Just 3 miles north of my last shot still left plenty of time to go aerial as the short train tiptoed north. I'm not sure what exactly these covered hoppers are carrying, although I do know they're destined for the Bridgestone factory at the end of active trackage in Oxford. While most rail cars can carry an abundance of commodities for even more industries, I've found black covered hoppers to remain within circulation for rubber tire manufacturers. I'm not sure as to the reasoning behind this, but at least the railcar's colors makes it easy to determine where they're heading. I was very pleased with this run-by, as a GP60, Golden Lighting, and Country Crossing are hard to do wrong by. The odds of running into another railfan in the backwoods of STEM are low, but apparently never zero. As it was my first time on the D-line, it was nice to have some guidance, and refreshing to know I didn't have to hastily pack the drone up. If I want to fly while chasing trains, I usually have to time my locations accordingly, but with no airports anywhere nearby and P-20's slow speed, I was pleased to have free reign over when and where I flew. Even though I was liberal with airtime in STEM, my new friend and I were still able to handily beat P-20 into the community of Providence. There's not much more to the town other than the county road and its railroad crossing, which provided a lovely S-curve to frame the 34-year-old GP60. I get distracted pretty easily when rail fanning. I said STEM would be my last shot, but couldn't resist one more in Providence. And once I was in Providence, I wanted another one closer to Oxford. Imagine that. Sometimes not knowing when to fold 'em is a good thing, as I was pleased to be airborne again for the all-black train through some Carolina countryside. Much like I enjoy watching short lines move long-haul freight, I appreciate chasing Class 1 locals. It's neat to see companies operating outside of their usual scope, with L617 and P20 fun examples of the big guys running small trains. These two trains had yielded an MP15 and GP60 liter, remarkable engines to consecutively chase. NS wasn't finished with the fun, however, and I was back in Durham 3 weeks later to cash in. Around 6 p.m., my scanner announced the good news as P20 phoned the dispatcher.
We riding this 5642, that's an NS 5642 Opal.
Engine 5642 on the head end, Norfolk Southern's GP38-2, dedicated to training first responders. Based out of Durham for months, the unique locomotive has primarily been assigned to the city's yard switcher, making its way onto P20 when the extra horsepower is needed. I was set up just outside of Durham yard limits to witness the show, as the local had just swung off the North Carolina Railroad's main line and is now underway for Oxford. My search for 5642 was the driving factor behind my recent scouting of train P20. I was quite happy that the chips had fallen into place on only my second attempt, as 5642's addition to the lineup meant P20 was likely much larger than the 3-car version I'd previously seen. And boy, if that weren't the case. with 40 cars out of Durham, 1 center beam, 7 company ballast cars, 22 shorty hoppers, and 10 high-cube boxcars made up the mainline-worthy consist. I'm looking over CSX tracks to watch the NS local, as this is the point where the two railroads join for their odd Durham double track. In case there were any doubts as to who owned the tracks prior to NS, the southern whistle post still stands to clear the air. It fascinates me to ponder just how long that sign has stood right there. I'm passing the location at which CSX's tracks abruptly end, which aligns with the end of NS's yard limits and subsequent increase in speed. Thrashing through the notches, 5642's addition to the lineup meant track speed was quickly and loudly achieved. I'm somewhat glad that 5642 hadn't led during my previous chase, as I was able to scout the line in a relaxed manner. Because of this, I knew I had to get out of Durham quickly if I wanted to beat the train to Crozet, a spot I had yet to hit. The trackside neighborhood hosts an uphill curve, as the rails climb away from the nearby Falls Lake and emerge from the foliage in a dramatic fashion. P20 was doing just that as I hurriedly set up, with the sublime sounds of wide-open EMDs approaching as the engineer unknowingly made my day. Aside from tonight's leader, I was pretty interested in the 7 company ballast hoppers. They're bound for Sunrock Industries just up the hill in Butner, who supplies ballast for NS maintenance projects all across North Carolina. Sunrock flips the script on traditional relationships between the railroad and line-side industries, as NS is actually a customer of theirs, as opposed to the other way around. The mine is one of 5 industries along the remains of today's D-line, with a corn syrup transload facility and lumber distributor on the north side of Butner, plus Bridgestone tires and a roofing company in Oxford. Crozet isn't too far from Butner, which is home to not much other than the aforementioned Sunrock, an Army National Guard training facility, and an abandoned industrial park. I'm not sure when the last train left out of here, but didn't have much time to wonder what could have been. In fact, I didn't even have time to finish my sub before I could hear 5642 churning uphill back at Pallet 1 with some more wonderful light. While I normally stay away from Class 1s, there's something so enjoyable about exploring their branch lines. It's really neat seeing the big railroads run small, localized service on obscure trackage such as the D-line, whose tracks barely rose above the sawdust. It's also intriguing to wonder what factors motivate the Class 1s to keep their branch lines as opposed to selling them off. Perhaps an educated guess on future growth, bolstered by large trains like tonight's P20. When I'm rail fanning historic trackage, I usually like to daydream about what these rails have seen. The D line has definitely hosted cool trains, whether it be Southern High Hoods from 50 years ago or NS's only uniquely painted 4-axle. The whole train was very aesthetically pleasing, complete with the 2 Jeeps from my previous chase and a slew of shorty-covered hoppers. Aside from the center beam up front, the remaining 22 hoppers and 10 boxcars will go all the way up the line to Certainteed, where the granular formula inside the hoppers will be turned into roofing shingles and distributed via the high cube boxcars. I'm always impressed by customers that provide business for the railroad on both ends, with raw material inbound and finished goods outbound. While track speed is slow, P20's length still made it hard to beat through the minimal grade crossings in the area. It was a bit of a catch-22, as the lengthy consist is the only reason 5642 got added this evening, but also meant line-side switching was plentiful and beating the train was harder than before. I was still more than happy to be chasing the specially painted locomotive and decided to wait at Stem's country crossing yet again while the crew dropped their center beam at a secluded industry. It was a peaceful 45-minute wait, which ended as 5642 sounded for the crossings to my south. Painted red in late 2015, the GP38-2 was meant to complement Norfolk Southern's Operation Awareness and Response train set. Specially modified for training emergency responders on how to remedy incidents on the high iron, the OAR set tours NS's system headed up by SD60E number 911 and the 5642. Curiously enough, though, the red Jeep hadn't run the ore train in nearly a year, last united with its consist at the North Carolina Transportation Museum's Fire Truck Festival the previous summer. There's something so cool about seeing the Thoroughbred logo against a red and white standard cab, and this is the only locomotive you'll find that look on. Not a heritage engine, nor specifically a tribute locomotive, its specific task is to look pretty next to the ore train when on tour. That apparently hasn't happened since the festival, as the engine found its way from Spencer into Durham and has been working RDU locals since. Ahead of the cab, you'll find the TransCare logo, representing the outreach program designed to shed light on the importance of hazmat training. It's joined by 3 more logos behind the cab, being the colloquial symbols for EMS, police, and fire departments. Similar to the many badges on CSX's Spirit locomotives, I appreciate NS's open support for meaningful organizations on the side of 5642. As I had learned during my previous chase, Stem makes for a good aerial pace. It's one of the only spots where the trees lend a worthwhile view from the sky and provides plenty of time on either end of the train's passage to get situated. North of Stem, the tracks are unreachable until the S-curve in Providence, but I decided to push 2 blocks further north, and I was not disappointed. Closer to Virginia than I am Durham, the Carolina countryside never fails. I'm set up in the truck bed along Peak Road, watching as the sunset paints the sky and listening as P20 traverses the D-line's hogbacks. While the grades themselves aren't terribly daunting, the up and down nature of the D-line made this evening's chase an EMD orchestra as the 3 locomotives worked on their cardio. Oxford sits at the same elevation as Durham, although the hill country makes P20's journey a little more interesting for an enthusiast like myself. P20 had crested one hill just to stare down another here at Peak Road, where the grade is evident as the line of shorty hoppers seems to bend towards the sky. As my previous 2 chases had ended with the daylight, so did tonight's. The beautiful hues of sunset meant I'd end on a wonderful note here at Peak Road. Very pleased to have seen the specialty switcher on the rural branch line. Thanks for railfanning with me today. I hope you enjoyed chasing these special Raleigh locals as much as I did.